The gun was 3 inches from Rosalie Thornton's chest when she made the choice that would change everything. It was 9:51 p.m. on a rainy November night in Brooklyn's Little Italy, and 3 masked men had just stormed into Maggie's Corner Café, the small restaurant belonging to her dying mother. They wanted the $240 in the register. But when the youngest robber turned his weapon on the frail old man sitting in the back booth, Rosalie didn't think. She simply stepped between the gun and the stranger. The old man she shielded was Giuseppe Rinaldi, the retired head of one of the most powerful Italian-American organizations on the East Coast, a man they called the Grey Wolf of Brooklyn. Rosalie had no idea. By morning, 4 armed guards would arrive at her cafe's door, sent by Giuseppe's son, a dangerous man named Maxwell Rinaldi, who would look at Rosalie and see something he'd stopped believing was real. Because in Italian tradition, when you save someone's life, you create debito d'onore, a debt of honor so profound it binds families across generations. But 12 hours before that robbery, Rosalie Thornton was just a 27-year-old waitress who counted every dollar and prayed her dying mother would see one more sunrise. If you love stories of unexpected love and second chances, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Share this with someone who believes kindness always finds its way back. Stay tuned, because what happens next will take your breath away. But while the world saw a hero in the making, 12 hours earlier, Rosalie Thornton was just a woman drowning in debt. She stood behind the register of Maggie's Corner Café, the silence of the room amplified by the meager stack of cash in her hand. $240, the exact price of her despair. Tomorrow's food invoice was $380, due the moment delivery arrived, no exceptions. The rent was 5 days late. The electric bill sat in the pile of unopened mail on the kitchen table. Her mother's pain medication was running low, and the next refill required insurance she wasn't sure was still active. Rosalie closed her eyes, drew in a deep breath, then shut the register. She'd gotten used to numbers that never added up. The cafe was only 800 square feet, tucked on a quiet corner in Little Italy, Brooklyn, wedged between a bakery that had closed last year and an antiques shop nobody ever seemed to enter. The linoleum floor was worn so thin that the most traveled paths showed through like faint roads. The vinyl chairs were cracked, patched with matching tape that still couldn't hide the tears beneath. The menu was written in chalk on the blackboard behind the counter, Maggie's handwriting from 30 years ago, slanting slightly to the right, as if it were always reaching for something just out of range. This wasn't a fancy cafe. This was where the neighborhood grandmothers came for tea and complaints about their daughters-in-law. This was where construction workers stopped in for sandwiches without looking at the price. This was the place Rosalie had called home for 12 years. At 10 o'clock in the morning, when she flipped the sign from closed to open, the place was empty. That wasn't unusual. On weekdays, the customers came in scattered, most of them familiar faces. Rosalie brewed a fresh pot of coffee, even though she knew she might end up pouring it down the sink at day's end. She checked the refrigerator, made notes of what was running low, then started wiping tables even though they'd been clean since the night before. Her hands needed something to do while her mind sprinted through numbers. By noon, she climbed the narrow staircase behind the cafe, up to the small 2-bedroom apartment right above the shop. Maggie lay in bed, the blanket pulled to her chest, her skin so pale it was almost translucent. Her breathing was heavy, each breath an effort. The room held a faint mix of medicine and lavender from the sachet Rosalie had hung at the head of the bed, trying to cover the smell of sickness. Lung cancer had spread to her liver 3 months ago. The doctor had stopped using the word recovery a long time ago. Now they only spoke of time left and quality of life. Maggie opened her eyes at the sound of her daughter's footsteps. She tried to smile, but it couldn't hide the exhaustion in her gaze. "Don't worry about me. Was the cafe busy?" Rosalie swallowed, kept her voice steady. "It was so busy, Mom. You just rest." The lie slipped out so easily that she wondered how many times she'd already told it. Maggie nodded, her eyes already drifting closed. "My good girl," she whispered, before sinking into sleep. Rosalie stood there watching her for a long time. 12 years earlier, she'd been a 15-year-old kid returned to the foster care system for the 5th time. 6 years spent in temporary houses, unfamiliar faces, promises that never held. Hard to get close to, they'd said about her. Doesn't fit in, has issues. Then Maggie had appeared, a single woman of 50 with a small cafe and a heart bigger than Brooklyn. She'd looked at Rosalie and said, "You don't have anything wrong with you. You just need someone who won't give up on you." 12 years later, Maggie still hadn't given up, and Rosalie would never give up on her. On her way back downstairs, she paused at the kitchen table, where a white envelope sat mixed into the stack of mail. Rosalie had deliberately left it unopened for 3 days, but today she couldn't hide from it anymore. Inside was the hospital bill, $15,000 for the next round of chemotherapy. The insurance covered 40%. That left $9,000. She had $240 in the register, and a café that was slowly dying. Rosalie folded the bill, slid it into the bottom drawer where Maggie would never find it. Then she went back down to the café, and smiled at the first customer of the day, as if everything was fine. Evening came slowly. At 9:47 p.m., the café was nearly empty, with only one customer left in the back corner booth, an old man with white hair, a face lined with wrinkles, and eyes that were still strangely sharp. Mr. Rinaldi, as she'd always called him. He'd come every Tuesday and Thursday night for 8 months, always the same seat, always unsweetened green tea, sometimes a slice of toast. He left a tip of exactly 15%, never more, never less, as if he'd calculated every cent. Lately, he'd begun asking about Maggie. "Is your mother doing better?" His voice was gentle, sincerely concerned, and Rosalie couldn't understand why a stranger would pay that much attention to her life. She glanced at the clock on the wall. 9:47, 13 minutes until closing. Rosalie picked up the rag and wiped the counter for the 3rd time in 10 minutes, not because it was dirty, but because her hands needed something to do while her mind spun itself sick on numbers. $240, $380, $9,000, $15,000. The figures circled like a cruel dance with no end. Outside the glass door, rain began to pour. Not a soft drizzle, but big, heavy drops that slapped the window as if they wanted to break their way inside. Streetlights blurred through the sheet of water, turning Little Italy into a watercolor painting that was melting as you watched it. Rosalie thought about closing early. Nobody was going to come in now, not in weather like this. She glanced toward Mr. Rinaldi. He was still sitting there, his newspaper neatly folded on the table, his tea long gone cold. He stared out the window with the expression of someone waiting for something. Then the cafe door flew open. 3 masked men burst in, the cold rain following them like a curse. "Register, now!" the youngest one screamed, his gun shaking. But when he swung the barrel toward the back booth, toward the silent old man who had become a fixture in her life, Rosalie's feet moved before her mind could scream, "Stop!" She stepped into the cold line of fire, her heart a drum against her ribs. "Take the money," she whispered, staring into the robber's panicked eyes. "Leave him alone." The wail of a police siren rose from somewhere a few blocks away, ripping through the rainy night. The 3 robbers vanished into the darkness as fast as they had appeared, leaving the cafe door swinging in the cold wind. Rosalie stood in the middle of the room, her legs shaking so hard she had to grip the edge of the nearest table to keep from collapsing. Her heart hammered wildly in her chest, each beat feeling like it was trying to crack her ribs. What had she just done? She had stepped between a gun and a stranger. She had almost died over $240 she did not even own. Behind her, the old man stood up, not rushed, not panicked. Calm, as if he had just finished an ordinary afternoon tea instead of having a gun pointed at his face. Rosalie turned to look at him and met a gaze that made her shiver. It was not the usual gratitude people offered someone who had helped them. It was something deeper, heavier, as if he were seeing straight through her, weighing her, considering something she could not understand. He walked to the table, took 3 $100 bills from the inside pocket of his coat, folded neatly, and set them down with a slow, careful motion. "Your kindness will not be forgotten." His voice was low and firm, each word chosen with intention. Then, before Rosalie could open her mouth to say anything at all, he stepped out the door and disappeared into the rain like a ghost. She stood there, watching until there was nothing left to see but water pouring from a black sky. $300 lay on the table, nearly 3 days of revenue on the cafe's best days. Rosalie did not understand. She did not understand why he had left that money. She did not understand why she had just stood in front of a bullet for someone completely unknown. She wondered if she was insane, or if it was only the instinct of someone who had grown too used to protecting things that were fragile. 2 police officers arrived 10 minutes later. They asked the usual questions. How many robbers? What were they wearing? Did they have weapons? How much money did they take? Rosalie answered mechanically. describing what she could remember about the 3 masked men. But she did not mention the old man. She did not speak of him being there, of the gun aimed at him, of her stepping in front. She did not know why she kept that secret. It was only a feeling in her chest, an instinct whispering that some things should not be said out loud. The officers wrote notes, handed her a business card, said they would contact her if there was any new information. Rosalie took the card, already knowing she would never get a call. This was Brooklyn. Small robberies like this happened every night, and the police had other priorities. After they left, Rosalie locked up and climbed the stairs, her legs heavy as lead. Maggie was still asleep, her breathing steady in the dark room. Rosalie pulled a chair beside her mother's bed and looked at the pale face resting in sleep. She thought about how close she had come to dying tonight. She thought about the barrel only inches from her chest. She thought about the youngest robber's eyes, panicked and drugged, his finger trembling on the trigger. If he had pulled it, if the sirens had come a few seconds later, Rosalie would not be sitting here. And Maggie, what would happen to Maggie? Who would care for her? Who would lie and say the café was busy? Who would hide hospital bills in the drawer? Tears ran down Rosalie's cheeks, but she made no sound. She had learned long ago how to cry in silence, back in the foster homes, where crying out loud meant weakness, and weakness meant being sent back. She opened her hand and looked at the 3 $100 bills, crumpled from how tightly she had been holding them. $300, enough to pay tomorrow's food invoice, enough left over to buy her mother's pain medication. A small amount, but right now it felt like a miracle. Your kindness will not be forgotten. The old man's words echoed in her mind, one by one, heavy and full of hidden meaning. Rosalie did not understand what he meant. She did not know that sentence would change her life completely. She only knew that tonight she was still alive, her mother was still breathing, and tomorrow she would have enough money to keep the café doors open. Sometimes, that was enough. At 7 o'clock in the morning, Rosalie came down the stairs with swollen eyes from lack of sleep and dried tear tracks on her cheeks. She had barely managed to close her eyes last night, lying there staring at the ceiling and thinking about the gun barrel, about the old man's gaze, about the strange sentence she could not make sense of. But the café still had to open. Life still had to keep moving. She walked past the cash register, took the keys, and went to the front door. When she pulled the curtain aside to look out, Rosalie froze as if nailed to the floor. 4 men in black suits stood in a line on the sidewalk, directly in front of the café. 3 sleek black luxury cars were parked along the curb, the kind Rosalie only saw in movies or caught glimpses of on rich streets in Manhattan. The whole neighborhood was watching. The laundromat owner across the street stood behind the glass with a phone in her hand. The old man who sold newspapers on the corner stopped stacking papers, his mouth hanging open. Rosalie felt her heart pick up speed, the same frantic rhythm it had last night when the gun was aimed at her chest. She wanted to lock the door, run back upstairs, and pretend she was not home, but it was too late. The man at the front of the group had already seen her through the glass. He stepped forward, and Rosalie had no choice but to open the door. He was about 6 feet tall, solidly built with broad shoulders and a stern face that still did not look threatening. He was in his mid-30s, with short black hair cut neatly, and a small scar running along the left side of his jaw. His dark brown eyes swept over her quickly but thoroughly, as if judging whether she was a threat. "Miss Thornton?" His voice was low and polite. "I'm Dante Caruso. Mr. Rinaldi sends his thanks." Rosalie blinked. "Mr. Rinaldi? The old man from last night?" Dante nodded slowly, a deliberate motion. "Giuseppe Rinaldi. People call him the Grey Wolf of Brooklyn." Rosalie's world seemed to tilt for a moment. The Grey Wolf of Brooklyn. She had heard the name before, in whispered stories in the neighborhood, in news reports about the underworld she had half-watched on television. Giuseppe Rinaldi, the head of one of the most powerful families on the East Coast. The gentle old man who read his newspaper every Tuesday and Thursday night in her café. The old man who always ordered green tea and left exactly 15%. The old man who asked about her mother's health with a voice that sounded truly concerned. That old man was a mafia boss. Rosalie felt dizzy. Why would someone like him come to her shabby little café? Why would he sit there for 8 months without her knowing? And now she was tangled up with an underworld she only knew from movies and headlines. I just did what anyone would do." Her voice trembled, sounding weak even to her own ears. Dante looked at her, and something shifted in his eyes. Not pity, but almost respect. No, Miss Thornton. Not everyone steps in front of a bullet for a stranger. Most people would duck and call the police. You didn't. Rosalie did not know what to say. She stayed silent, and Dante went on. In our tradition, when you save someone's life, you create debito d'onore. He pronounced each Italian word clearly, as if he wanted to make sure she understood their weight. A debt of honor. The Rinaldi family owes you, Miss Thornton, and we don't leave debts unpaid. I don't need you to repay anything. Rosalie shook her head, her voice a little firmer as she found a shred of calm. I just want to live quietly. I have my café. I have my mother upstairs. I don't want to be involved in anything. Dante smiled, a faint flicker across his stern face, as if he had heard this many times before and had never truly believed it. That isn't your decision, Miss Thornton. Before Rosalie could protest, Dante continued. Mr. Rinaldi's son, Maxwell Rinaldi, will come to see you today. He wants to personally thank the person who saved his father. He spoke as if this were a privilege, an honor anyone should be grateful for. Rosalie wanted to say no. She wanted to say she did not need to meet anyone, did not want to be involved with the Rinaldi family or any powerful family, but she looked at the three men behind Dante, at the three luxury cars waiting, at the entire neighborhood watching every movement. She knew she had no choice. Dante nodded as if her silence were agreement, then turned and walked away. The other three men followed him, climbed into two of the cars, and drove off. But the third car stayed parked across from the café, silent and menacing. Rosalie stood alone at the café door, the morning air still damp from last night's rain. She looked up at the dull gray sky, then down at the empty street. Her normal life had ended the moment she stepped in front of a bullet for a stranger. She just had not realized it yet. From the end of the block, a glossy black Bentley was approaching. It slid along the road like a hunting animal, smooth and powerful. The car stopped directly in front of the café, and for a moment, everything seemed to hold still. Then the door opened. Rosalie held her breath. Her life was about to change forever, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The man who stepped out of the Bentley was about 6 feet 2 inches tall, broad-shouldered, with the walk of someone used to having the world move aside. He wore a perfectly tailored dark gray suit, the kind Rosalie knew had to cost more than a month of rent for her café. His black hair was slicked neatly back, revealing an angular face with a jawline sharp as a blade. But what caught Rosalie's attention most were his eyes, steel gray, cold, and utterly without emotion. The eyes of someone who had seen too much, done too much, and stopped caring a long time ago. He entered the café with absolute confidence, each step steady and deliberate, as if he owned not only this room, but the world outside it too. Rosalie recognized it at once. This was a man accustomed to power, born into power, and unaware of how to live without it. Maxwell Rinaldi stopped in the middle of the café, his gray eyes sweeping over every detail. The worn linoleum with its paths pressed in by years of footsteps, the cracked vinyl chairs patched with tape, the handwritten chalk menu on the old blackboard, the vintage coffee machine Rosalie had to pat every morning to make it cooperate. He did not look down on it, did not smirk or frown, but it was obvious this was not his world. He belonged to skyscrapers, Michelin-starred restaurants, penthouses overlooking Central Park, not an 800-square-foot café on a Little Italy corner, smelling of cheap coffee and toast. Miss Thornton. His voice was low, perfectly even, each word delivered with flawless control. I'm Maxwell Rinaldi. Rosalie stood behind the counter, both hands gripping the wooden edge to keep herself from shaking. I know. Your man introduced you. Maxwell stepped closer, and for the first time he truly looked at her. Not the brief glance he had used to survey the café, but a direct stare into her eyes, assessing, measuring. Rosalie felt stripped bare under that gaze, as if he could see every secret, every fear, every sleepless night spent counting money and listening to her mother's sickness deepen upstairs. You saved my father last night. Not a question. A statement. He was a customer. Rosalie lifted her chin, refusing to look away even as instinct screamed at her to lower her eyes. I did what anyone would do. Maxwell tilted his head slightly, a small motion, deliberate. No. Anyone would hide behind the counter and call 911. You stepped in front of the bullet. He paused for a beat. For a stranger. Someone you didn't know. Rosalie did not answer. She did not know what to say. She did not understand why she had done it either. My family owes you, Miss Thornton. Maxwell took another step, now only the counter between them. Debito d'onore. Whatever you need, we'll provide. Money, protection, anything. Rosalie drew in a slow breath. She thought of the $240 in the register, of the $9,000 bill hidden in the drawer, of Maggie upstairs, her breathing growing heavier by the day. She could accept. She could solve every financial problem with a single nod, but she also knew nothing was free in the world of men like Maxwell Rinaldi. Every gift came with a string. Every helping hand was a trap dressed up as kindness. I didn't save him to be repaid. Her voice came out clearer than she expected. I don't need your money. I don't need protection. I just want to live quietly. Silence. A heavy silence hung between them. Maxwell's brow tightened, only slightly, almost imperceptible. But Rosalie saw it. She saw the flicker of surprise in those gray eyes before it vanished as quickly as it had come. This was the first time in a long time someone had refused him to his face. Maybe the first time in his life. Then something unexpected happened. Maxwell smiled. Only for an instant, only the smallest lift at one corner of his mouth. But it was real. It softened his face, made his gray eyes less icy for the briefest moment. You're interesting, Miss Thornton. He took a business card from the inside pocket of his suit and set it gently on the counter. A black card with silver lettering, only a name and a line of phone numbers. Nothing else. When you need something, call this number. No matter what it is. No matter when. And without waiting for her answer, Maxwell turned and walked out. He moved with the same absolute confidence he had brought in, as if the conversation had been nothing more than a small task on a long list of things to do that day. The cafe door closed behind him, and Rosalie stood alone with the card on the counter. She looked down at it. Maxwell Rinaldi. A simple name for someone not simple at all. She picked it up, feeling the thick, smooth paper beneath her fingers. Then she tore it in half, tore it again, and dropped it into the trash under the counter. She did not need their help. She had taken care of herself and Maggie for years. She would keep doing it. Outside the glass, Dante stood by the Bentley and saw everything. He watched Rosalie tear the card with an expression he did not let anyone read, then turned as Maxwell stepped out. Inside the car, as the Bentley began to roll, Dante spoke. She tore the card, right in front of me. Maxwell did not turn back. His eyes stayed on the window, where Brooklyn's streets slid past. She tore it? His voice held no anger. Not the anger Dante had expected. Instead, there was something else. Curiosity. Boss, she doesn't know fear. Maxwell was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was lighter, as if he were talking to himself more than to Dante. No, she knows fear. She just has nothing to lose. He paused, then went on. Keep watching the cafe. From a distance. Don't let her know. Dante nodded, but his mind kept turning. 14 years working for Maxwell Rinaldi. 14 years watching his boss treat people like pieces on a chessboard. Never had he seen Maxwell take an interest in anyone like this. Never had he seen Maxwell want to keep watching someone after being refused. There was something different about this girl. And Dante was not sure whether that was a good thing or a bad one. The Bentley disappeared at the end of the block. Inside the cafe, Rosalie tried to work as if it were a normal day. She poured coffee for the first customer. She wiped tables, straightened chairs, checked the refrigerator. But her hands still trembled. And she could not stop thinking about those gray eyes, cold as steel. Yet for one moment, only one moment, she had seen something else underneath. Something lonely. Something searching for what it did not dare believe was real. 1 week after Maxwell Rinaldi walked out of the cafe, strange things began to happen. First came the utilities bill. Rosalie went to the utility company to pay off 2 months of overdue charges, only to have the clerk tell her her account had been paid in full 3 days earlier. Anonymous sender. Then came the call from the landlord. Miss Thornton, someone paid 2 months of rent for you. You don't need to worry about the late balance anymore. He said it with a voice that mixed surprise with curiosity, as if he wanted to ask which rich man she had gotten to know. Rosalie didn't know what to say. And the black car that always parked across from the cafe, from morning until night, day after day, she couldn't see anyone inside through the tinted windows, but she knew someone was watching. Rosalie tried to ignore it all for the first 3 days. She told herself that if she didn't react, they would get bored and go away. But on the 4th day, when she discovered someone had paid the cafe's food invoice too, Anger flared up so hard she couldn't hold it back anymore. She had been clear. She didn't need their help. She didn't want to be involved. Why wouldn't Maxwell Rinaldi understand? She looked up Rinaldi Enterprises online and called the main line. A polite female voice answered. Rinaldi Enterprises, how may I assist you? I want to see Maxwell Rinaldi. Immediately. Silence on the other end. Then the woman's voice hesitated. I'm sorry, ma'am, mister. Rinaldi doesn't receive visitors without an appointment. Tell him Rosalie Thornton is calling. From Maggie's Corner Café. He'll know. A longer pause. Please hold. 30 minutes later, a sleek black car pulled up in front of the cafe. The driver opened the door without a word, only gesturing for her to get in. Rosalie asked a neighbor to watch the cafe for a moment, and climbed into the car with anger still boiling in her chest. The car took her to a skyscraper in Manhattan, the kind with a glass front that reflected the sky and a bright silver logo over the main entrance. Rosalie was led into a private elevator, the kind with no floor buttons, only a key card to be swiped. The elevator stopped at the penthouse level, the doors opening onto a wide corridor with marble floors and paintings that looked like they cost more than her apartment. An assistant led her to a large wooden door, then stopped. Mr. Rinaldi is in a meeting, ma'am. Rosalie didn't wait. She pushed the door open and walked straight in. The conference room was large, with a long, polished wooden table, 6 men in expensive suits seated around it. And at the head of the table, Maxwell Rinaldi sat with that familiar, expressionless face. Everyone turned to look at her as she entered, their eyes widening in shock. Mr. Rinaldi. Rosalie's voice rang through the silent room. I need to talk to you. Right now. No one in the room dared to breathe. The 6 men stared at her as if she had grown 2 extra heads. No one spoke to Maxwell Rinaldi like this. No one barged into his meeting without an appointment. No one gave him orders. Maxwell looked at her, gray eyes giving nothing away. Then he signaled to the others. Out. No one argued. The 6 men stood and filed out in silence, closing the door behind them. Only Rosalie and Maxwell remained. I made myself clear. Rosalie stepped closer, anger hardening her voice. I don't need money. I don't need protection. Why won't you understand? Why are you still interfering in my life? Maxwell rose, came around the table toward her. He stood nearly a head taller, and at this distance Rosalie could smell expensive cologne and something else. Something warmer, more human. You're the first person who's ever barged into my meeting without trembling. His voice was calm, almost amused. I have nothing to lose, Mr. Rinaldi. Rosalie lifted her chin, refusing to back up. That makes me more dangerous than you think. Maxwell studied her for a long time, those gray eyes pausing on her face as if he were trying to read something underneath. And for the first time, Rosalie saw something else in that stare. Not contempt, not anger, respect, real respect. My father is dying, Miss Thornton. The words came out abruptly, so unexpected that Rosalie stopped mid-breath. The anger in her was cut clean off by those 4 words. Cancer. End stage. The doctors say he has a few months left. Maxwell's voice didn't shake, didn't waver, but Rosalie could hear something beneath that calm. Pain held down under layer after layer of control. Protecting you is the last thing he asked of me, the last thing he wants to do before he dies. Rosalie opened her mouth, then closed it. She thought of Maggie upstairs, each breath an effort. She understood what it felt like to watch someone you loved fade. She understood the helplessness of being unable to stop it, and she understood the urge to do anything at all, to ease the suffering of someone who was about to leave. I didn't know. Her voice was softer now. The anger drained away. Maxwell turned his back, walked to the window, and looked down at the city below. I won't interfere directly in your life, but someone will keep an eye on things, make sure you're safe. You have the right to refuse any help you don't want. He paused. That's the best deal I can offer. Rosalie looked at his back against the gray Manhattan sky. She could keep refusing. She could walk out and try to live as if the Rinaldi family didn't exist. But she also knew it wouldn't change anything. They would still watch. They would still protect. Because that was how their world worked. And because a dying old man wanted to repay a girl who had saved him. Fine, Rosalie said. But I decide my own life. No one gets to interfere without my consent. Maxwell turned back to her, and she could have sworn she saw something like relief flicker in those gray eyes. I respect that. Rosalie nodded, then turned and walked out of the room. She didn't look back. After the door closed, Maxwell stood by the window for a long time, staring down at the tiny people and cars below. Dante came in and stopped in the middle of the room. "Boss, she's different." Maxwell didn't turn around. "I know. Is that good or bad?" A pause. Then Maxwell spoke, his voice so low Dante had to lean in to hear it. "That's the problem." 3 days after the confrontation in Maxwell's office, Giuseppe Rinaldi walked into Maggie's corner cafe as if nothing had happened. The same familiar gray wool coat, the same neatly folded newspaper tucked under his arm, the same unhurried pace of an old man savoring his final years. He sat down in the exact same old corner table by the window facing the street, where he had sat every Tuesday and Thursday night for 8 months. Rosalie stood behind the counter and watched him with a strange feeling. She knew who he was now. The Grey Wolf of Brooklyn, the head of one of the most powerful families on the East Coast, a man whose name alone could make an entire neighborhood tremble. Yet when she looked at him sitting there, white hair, hands trembling slightly as he opened his paper, she saw only a lonely old man trying to find a little peace in whatever days he had left. She brewed a cup of green tea, unsweetened, and carried it to his table. "Your green tea, Mr. Rinaldi." Giuseppe looked up, and his aged eyes brightened when he saw her. He smiled, the gentle smile Rosalie had grown used to in the months before she knew the truth. "You're the first person who hasn't changed after learning who I am." His voice was warm, with a touch of surprise, and more than that, gratitude. "Everyone changes. They get afraid, or they start flattering. But you still look at me the way you look at an old customer who comes in for tea." Rosalie didn't know what to say. She stood there, still holding the tray, unsure whether she should return to the counter or stay. "Sit down," Giuseppe said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "The cafe is quiet. Keep an old man company for a little while." Rosalie hesitated for a moment, then sat. She set the tray aside, laced her fingers together on the tabletop. Giuseppe folded his newspaper and placed it to the side, as if this conversation mattered more than anything printed in the world. "The first time I came here was 8 months ago," he began, his voice slow, as if he were telling a story from long ago. "The doctor had just told me I have cancer. End stage. Nothing left to do but wait." He paused, looking out the window where small drops of rain had begun to fall onto the sidewalk. "I have lived 68 years in a world where everyone knows my name, where everyone fears me or wants something from me. I wanted to find a place where nobody knew who I was, a place where I could be nothing but an ordinary old man, reading a newspaper and drinking tea." He turned back to Rosalie, his eyes softening. "Your cafe gave me that." Rosalie felt her throat tighten. She understood that feeling. She too had searched for a place where she could simply be herself, not the abandoned kid, not the foster child, not the girl with a past full of scars. "My son," Giuseppe continued, and his voice shifted, heavier now. "Maxwell. He's hard, cold, but it isn't his fault." He sighed, and his old shoulders seemed to sink under the weight of memory. "My wife, his mother, died when he was 12. A car accident. A rainy night like the night you saved me." He paused, eyes gone distant. "I fell apart. Then I was angry. Then I became harsher than I have ever been, with everyone, with myself, and especially with Maxwell. I thought if he was strong, he would never be hurt the way I was. I thought I had to prepare him to inherit, had to make him ready for this cruel world." Giuseppe's eyes turned red, but he didn't let the tears fall. "I didn't teach him how to love. I taught him how to survive. That was the greatest mistake of my life." Rosalie listened in silence, her heart tightening. She thought of Maxwell, of those steel gray eyes, of the expressionless face, of the way he spoke as if everything were a transaction. She had thought he was cold by nature. She had never known he was cold because no one had taught him how to be warm. "I grew up without love too, Mr. Rinaldi." Her voice was soft. "I was in the foster care system for 6 years. 5 families sent me back. They said I had problems." She looked down at her hands. "But my foster mother, she taught me it's never too late to learn how to trust, to learn how to love, to learn how to let other people into your heart." Giuseppe looked at her for a long time, his gaze full of something Rosalie couldn't name. "You're a good person, Rosalie. Don't let our world change you. Don't let the darkness swallow the light in you." Outside the cafe, in the black Bentley parked a few cars down, Maxwell Rinaldi sat and watched through the glass. He hadn't planned to come today. He had an important meeting, a deal that needed closing, dozens of decisions waiting for him. But when Dante reported that his father was at the café, Maxwell couldn't stop himself from ordering the driver to bring him here. He told himself he only wanted to make sure his father was safe. But deep down, he knew that was a lie. He watched through the café window and saw his father sitting across from Rosalie. They were talking. He couldn't hear the words, but he could see the expression on his father's face. Giuseppe was smiling, not the practiced smile Maxwell was used to seeing at parties and meetings, not the cold smile he gave to opponents. This was a real smile, warm, the kind of smile Maxwell couldn't remember the last time he'd seen, maybe not since before his mother died, maybe not since he was a child who still believed the world could be good. Maxwell wondered what was special about that girl. She wasn't rich, wasn't powerful, had nothing he needed in any of his dealings. She was only a waitress in a shabby little café in Little Italy, trying to keep her foster mother alive and the café from closing. But she made his father smile, made him want to live a few more months, made him leave the cold mansion to sit in this small café and talk like an ordinary man. And when she looked at Maxwell, she didn't see Rinaldi. She didn't see power or money or threat. She looked straight into his eyes and told him she didn't need anything from him. She tore his business card right in front of him. She barged into his meeting and demanded he stop interfering in her life. No one treated Maxwell that way. No one dared. Something strange stirred in Maxwell's chest, a feeling he didn't know how to name. It wasn't comfortable, like a small stone stuck in his shoe that he couldn't shake loose. But it wasn't entirely unpleasant either. "Drive," he ordered the driver, abrupt. The Bentley eased away from the curb. Maxwell looked back at the café in the rearview mirror, seeing the silhouettes of his father and Rosalie still sitting by the window. He didn't know what he was feeling. He had spent 24 years building a wall around his heart. And now a girl with warm brown eyes and a stubbornness he couldn't explain was making that wall tremble. Inside the café, Rosalie walked Giuseppe to the door as evening began to fall. The old man stood on the sidewalk, pulling his coat tighter against the cold wind. "Will I see you again, Mr. Rinaldi?" Rosalie asked, surprised to realize she truly wanted the answer to be yes. Giuseppe turned back and smiled at her, a smile she now knew was rare. Tuesday and Thursday, as always. He walked away, disappearing into the waiting car. Rosalie watched until the taillights vanished around the corner. Then she went back inside, cleared the teacup from Giuseppe's table, and she realized something strange. She was looking forward to Tuesday and Thursday nights. She was looking forward to sitting down and listening to that old man's stories. She was looking forward to feeling as if she had a grandfather she had never had. At 2:00 in the morning, Rosalie was jolted awake by coughing. Not the ordinary cough she had grown used to hearing from her mother's room for months. This was violent, tearing through the late-night silence, the cough of someone fighting to pull air into failing lungs. She sprang out of bed, bare feet slapping the cold wooden floor, her heart pounding as if it might break out of her chest. When she shoved open Maggie's door, the sight in front of her turned her blood to ice. Maggie was propped against the headboard, both hands gripping the blanket, her whole body shaking with every cough. Her lips were bluish-purple, her eyes were rolled back in panic, like a fish lifted from water, suffocating. Each cough sounded like cloth ripping, wet and heavy, and Rosalie knew this was not a normal cough. She couldn't breathe. She was dying right in front of her. "Mom, Mom." Rosalie threw herself to the bedside, one arm around her mother's shoulders, the other hand shaking as it searched for her phone in the pocket of her sleep shirt. She dialed 911, her voice trembling so hard she wasn't sure the person on the other end could understand her. "My mother can't breathe. Please come now. Please." She gave the address, repeating it again and again until they confirmed an ambulance was on the way. 8 minutes. They said 8 minutes, but those 8 minutes stretched out like an entire lifetime. Rosalie sat holding her mother, trying to keep her upright so she could breathe a little easier, whispering words she wasn't even sure meant anything. "Mom, I'm here. You're going to be okay. You have to be okay. I can't lose you. I can't." Tears ran down her face without her noticing. Maggie looked at her, eyes full of pain and full of love, and she tried to smile through the lung-tearing coughs, as if she were trying to tell Rosalie everything would be all right, even though they both knew it might be a lie. The ambulance arrived. Uniformed people flooded into the small room, lifted Maggie onto a gurney, fitted an oxygen mask over her face. Rosalie ran with them down the stairs, climbed into the ambulance, and held her mother's hand the whole way to the hospital. She's still breathing, Rosalie told herself. She's still here. At the hospital, they rushed Maggie into the emergency room and told Rosalie to wait outside. The doors slammed shut in her face, and suddenly she was alone in a cold white hallway under harsh fluorescent lights. She found a plastic chair and sat down, her knees trembling, her hands still marked with dried blood from where Maggie had clawed at herself trying to breathe. Time passed like torture. No one told her anything. No one noticed her sitting there alone in the middle of the night, in an old sleep shirt and slippers. Rosalie stared at the phone in her hand. Her contacts list was empty. No family to call, because Maggie was her only family. No close friends to lean on, because she had spent her whole life building walls, keeping everyone out. She was completely alone. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of that loneliness press down on her chest like a stone. Then she saw a number in her call history. Rinaldi Enterprises, from the time she had called demanding to see Maxwell. She stared at it for a long time, her finger hovering over the screen. 3 o'clock in the morning. She shouldn't call. Who was he to her? A stranger. A man from a world entirely different from hers. But she needed someone. She needed to hear a voice. She needed to know she wasn't completely alone in this world. She pressed call. The phone rang once. Only once. Then Maxwell's voice came through, strangely awake for 3 in the morning, as if he had been waiting for this call. Rosalie? She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Instead, a choked sob broke loose from her throat, and then all the tears she had held back for so long finally spilled over. She cried into the phone, unable to say anything, only broken gasps and ragged breaths. Where are you? Maxwell's voice held not a trace of annoyance or irritation, only concern. Real concern. Rosalie forced herself to breathe, forced each word past the tight knot in her throat. She gave the name of the hospital, her voice shaking so badly she had to repeat it twice. 20 minutes. I'll be there. He hung up. Rosalie stared at the darkened screen, not sure whether she had done the right thing or the wrong thing, but she had no time to think about it. All she could do was sit there, wait, and pray Maggie would make it through the night. Exactly 20 minutes later, Maxwell Rinaldi walked into the hospital corridor. He wasn't wearing a suit the way he always did. Just a black shirt, slacks, his hair slightly mussed as if he had just gotten out of bed. Rosalie had never seen him like this. Not perfect, not controlling every detail. He looked more human. He came to where she sat without speaking, and simply sat down in the plastic chair beside her. His presence filled the emptiness next to her, quiet but warm. And suddenly, Rosalie didn't feel alone anymore. They sat in silence for a long time. Then Rosalie began to speak, as if something had broken open inside her and everything poured out, impossible to hold back. She's the only person who never abandoned me. Her voice was rough from crying. I was in 5 families before I found her. They all sent me back. They said I had problems. They said I didn't know how to love. They said I was damaged goods. She drew a trembling breath. Then she came. She looked at me and said, "You're not broken. You just need someone who won't give up on you." And she never did. 12 years. She never gave up on me. Maxwell listened. He didn't interrupt, didn't try to offer hollow advice like everything will be okay or you have to be strong. He only sat there and listened. Really listened. To every word. And Rosalie realized this was the first time anyone besides Maggie had ever truly listened to her, truly wanted to know how she felt. The emergency room doors opened. A doctor in a white coat walked toward them, his face tired but not completely grim. "Miss Thornton? Your mother has stabilized." Rosalie let out a breath, as if a stone had been lifted off her chest. But the doctor hesitated, and that single word tightened Rosalie's heart again. Her condition is more serious than we thought. There's an experimental treatment that could help her. It's the best chance. But the cost is $80,000, and insurance doesn't cover it. $80,000. The numbers spun through Rosalie's mind like a cyclone. She didn't have $800. She was fighting to pay rent and the electric bill. 80,000 might as well have been 80 million, compared to everything she had. She collapsed back into the chair, eyes empty, staring at nothing. Maxwell stood up. He stepped into the hallway, pulled his phone from his pocket. Rosalie watched him without feeling, too drained to wonder what he was doing. She caught fragments of his voice, words like immediately. Don't care what it costs. Do it. 5 minutes later, he came back, sat down beside her. It's done. His voice was calm, as if he had just ordered a cup of coffee. She'll get the treatment, starting tomorrow. Rosalie stared at him, not believing what she was hearing. What did you just do? Maxwell didn't answer directly. He only looked at her with those gray eyes that for the first time held something warm inside them. Don't worry about the money. That isn't your problem. Rosalie sprang up from the chair, her heart beating out of rhythm from too many emotions at once. Relief, because Maggie would be saved. Confusion, because an enormous sum had just been paid by someone who was almost a stranger. And fear. Fear because she knew nothing was free in this world, especially in the world of men like Maxwell Rinaldi. What did you just do? She asked again, her voice trembling. $80,000. I can't accept it. What am I supposed to pay you with? Maxwell looked at her, his gray eyes calm as a lake without a ripple. Nothing. Nothing? Rosalie repeated, unable to believe her own ears. You just paid $80,000 for someone you've met a few times. Don't tell me there aren't conditions. Maxwell stood, facing her. He was nearly a head taller. But in that moment, the difference didn't make her feel threatened the way it had the first time they met. This is my debt to you, Miss Thornton. Not the other way around. His voice was firm, without a trace of hesitation. You saved my father. I keep your mother alive. We're even. Rosalie wanted to argue. She wanted to say what she had done wasn't worth $80,000. She wanted to say she didn't want to owe anyone anything. But when she looked into Maxwell's eyes, she saw something that made the words catch in her throat. He wasn't doing this to control her. He wasn't setting a trap. He truly believed this was a debt he had to pay. Maxwell sat back down, and for the first time Rosalie saw him lower his guard. His broad shoulders sagged slightly, his face no longer tight like a steel mask. He looked down at his hands, fingers laced together, and when he spoke his voice was lower, almost a whisper. When my mother died, I was 12. Rosalie went still, not expecting him to say this. Slowly, she sat back down in the chair beside him, silent, listening. A car accident. A rainy night, Maxwell continued, his eyes still lowered. They brought her to the hospital, but it was too late. I sat alone in the hallway all night, waiting for news, like you are now. He paused and drew a deep breath. My father was in the room next door, with doctors, with lawyers, with important people. But he didn't come out. Not once. I sat there all night, alone, in a cold corridor like this, waiting for someone to come tell me everything would be okay. No one came. Silence. Rosalie felt her heart tighten. She looked at Maxwell, and for the first time she didn't see a powerful mafia boss with a criminal empire and expensive cars. She saw a 12-year-old boy sitting alone in a hospital, waiting for his father to come and watching him never come. She saw a man who had been lonely his whole life, building high walls around himself because no one had taught him how to let anyone in. I understand that feeling, she said, her voice as light as breath, having no one. Maxwell lifted his head, gray eyes meeting her brown ones. In that moment there were no barriers between them, no distance of wealth and poverty, no underworld and ordinary world, nothing but two people who had once been lonely down to the bone and had somehow found each other in a hospital corridor at 4 a.m. You have your mother, Maxwell said. You're not alone. Rosalie smiled sadly. Not now, but before I met Maggie. She didn't finish. She didn't have to. Maxwell nodded. He understood. He understood the numbness of loneliness. He understood what it felt like to believe no one in the world cared whether you lived or died. He understood because he had lived with that feeling for 24 years. They sat in silence after that. But it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence shared by two people who didn't need words to understand each other. Sometimes silence is its own kind of connection, deeper than any conversation. Outside the window, the sky began to shift from black to gray to pale pink. The first light of a new day slipped through the glass and touched the cold corridor, carrying a faint warmth with it. Maxwell stood up, and Rosalie felt a strange disappointment rise in her chest. She didn't want him to leave. She wanted him to stay here, sitting beside her, so she could know she wasn't alone. But she didn't say it. She didn't know how to say it. I have to go, Maxwell said, his voice returning to that familiar, controlled calm. But something was different, a little softer. But if you need anything... I know. Rosalie stood too, looking at him. Call you. Maxwell nodded. For a moment they stood facing each other, neither of them speaking. Then he turned and walked away, his stride still confident but no longer as cold as before. Rosalie watched until he disappeared behind the door at the end of the corridor. She stood there a long time, staring at the space where he had vanished. Her heart beat with a strange rhythm she didn't recognize. For the first time in her life, she didn't want someone to leave. For the first time, she wanted someone to stay. And she didn't know what to do with that feeling. She didn't know what to do with the man with gray eyes and a heart turned to ice, who somehow still knew how to sit down beside her at 3 a.m. and listen to her cry. 2 weeks after the night at the hospital, Maxwell Rinaldi began showing up at Maggie's Corner Cafe more often. The first time, he said it was to check on her mother, to ask whether the treatment was working, whether Maggie needed anything else. Rosalie nodded, answered in short sentences, thanked him politely, and kept her distance. The second time, he said he was passing by and stopped in. Rosalie didn't ask why a man who lived in Manhattan would be passing by a small street in Little Italy, Brooklyn. The third time, the fourth, the fifth, he didn't need a reason anymore. He just came. The black Bentley parked in front of the cafe every evening after work became part of the familiar scene, like the street lamp on the corner or the old sign of the bakery next door. Rosalie didn't know what to feel about it. Part of her wanted him gone, wanted her life to return to normal, without a luxury car at her door and the curious looks of the neighbors. But another part of her, the part she didn't want to admit existed, found herself looking toward the door whenever she heard a car stop, felt her heart beat a little faster when the cafe door opened, and that tall, familiar figure stepped inside. One night, Maxwell sat down and ordered coffee with the clipped command he used with everyone. Black coffee. He didn't look up. He didn't add another word. Rosalie stayed where she was, not moving. Maxwell lifted his head, his brow tightening. Why aren't you making it? You have to say please when you order, Mr. Rinaldi. Rosalie's voice was calm, but firm. Maxwell stared at her as if she had spoken a foreign language. I'm paying. Why do I have to say please? Because that's how you treat another person, like a human being, Rosalie said. Not like a servant. Not like someone under you. Like a person. Silence stretched between them. Rosalie thought he would get angry, would stand up and leave, would never come back to this tiny cafe again. But Maxwell didn't do any of that. He looked at her for a long time, gray eyes unreadable, then gave a small nod. The next night, when he ordered coffee, the first words out of his mouth were, "Please, a cup of black coffee." Rosalie smiled, the first smile she had given him since the night at the hospital. He was learning, slowly, awkwardly, but learning. In the weeks that followed, Rosalie began to notice small changes in Maxwell. He stopped wearing a suit when he came to the cafe, only a dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up, as if he were trying to slip out of the armor he wore all day. He sat in Giuseppe's old place, the corner table by the window, the spot where the old man still sat every Tuesday and Thursday night. Sometimes Maxwell only sat there reading the newspaper, saying nothing to her, and that was enough. His quiet presence filled the cafe in a way she couldn't explain. Rosalie began to pay attention to the little details about him, the way he always sat facing the door, never with his back to the entrance, the alert habit of someone who had lived too long in a dangerous world, the faint scar crossing his right hand, from the base of his index finger down to his wrist, the trace of something she didn't dare ask about, the way he never ate when anyone else was watching, always waiting until she turned away or got busy with something before lifting the coffee to his mouth. The walls he had built around himself were so high that light could barely slip in, but sometimes, just sometimes, she caught a glimpse of cracks. Dante noticed the change first. One evening, when he picked Maxwell up after the cafe, he glanced at his boss in the rearview mirror. Maxwell was looking out the window, eyes far away, and on his mouth there was something almost like a smile. Dante had worked for Maxwell for 14 years. He had seen his boss angry, cold, ruthless, indifferent. But he had never seen Maxwell smile without some tactical reason behind it. "Boss, what is that girl doing to you?" Dante asked once, half joking, half serious. Maxwell didn't answer, because he didn't know either. Late one night, when the clock had already struck 10 and Rosalie was flipping the sign to closed, Maxwell was still sitting at the corner table. She looked at him and lifted an eyebrow. "We're closed, Mr. Rinaldi." "My car broke down," he said without looking up. Rosalie knew it was a lie. The Bentley was parked right outside, gleaming under the streetlights, but she didn't call him on it. She only nodded and kept cleaning, stacking chairs on tables, mopping the floor, turning off most of the lights. The café sank into darkness, with only the streetlight spilling in through the glass, casting bands of light and shadow across the floor. Rosalie came back from behind the counter, with a damp cloth in her hand, and almost slammed straight into Maxwell, standing right behind her. She hadn't heard him get up, hadn't heard his footsteps coming close. He moved like a shadow, silent and quick. They stood only inches apart, close enough that she could feel the warmth rising from his body, close enough to catch the clean, masculine scent of his cologne mixed with coffee. Their eyes met in the dark. No one spoke, no one moved. Rosalie felt her chest lift and fall faster, her heart beating like a war drum. Maxwell's gray eyes weren't cold anymore. They had gone dark, filled with something she didn't dare name. Maxwell leaned forward, just a little, but enough that she felt his breath at her lips. Everything in her screamed that this was insane, that he was who he was, and she was who she was, that their worlds could never touch. But her body didn't listen. She stayed still, waiting, heart pounding wild. Then Maxwell stopped. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, as if fighting with himself, then stepped back. 1 step, 2 steps. The space between them opened like an abyss. "I have to go." His voice was rougher than usual. "Good night, Miss Thornton." He turned and walked out without looking back. The door shut hard behind him, leaving Rosalie alone in the dark café. Her heart was still racing. Her mouth was dry. She knew he had almost kissed her. She knew she had wanted him to, and that frightened her more than any gun ever aimed at her chest. The next night, at 9:30 p.m., Maxwell Rinaldi walked into Maggie's corner café. The place was about to close, with only one customer left finishing the last of his coffee in a far corner. But Maxwell didn't sit down like he always did. He stood in the middle of the café, arms relaxed at his sides, watching Rosalie behind the counter. He didn't say a word. He only looked at her. And Rosalie knew he hadn't come here for coffee. She waited until the last customer paid and left, then flipped the sign to closed. The door shut, and they faced each other in the empty café, streetlight spilling through the glass and laying down stripes of light and shadow across the floor. Rosalie didn't want to circle around it. She had been awake all night, thinking about that moment, the way he had leaned toward her and then stopped, the way he had walked out without looking back. "Why did you stop last night?" she asked plainly, her voice steadier than she expected. Maxwell was silent. His gray eyes never left her, but he didn't answer. "You almost kissed me," Rosalie went on, stepping out from behind the counter and moving 1 step closer. "Then you ran like you were afraid." She tilted her head, studying him with a challenge she didn't know she carried. "You, Maxwell Rinaldi, what are you afraid of?" The silence between them stretched out, heavy and tight. Then Maxwell spoke, his voice so low it was almost a whisper. "You." Rosalie went still. Of all the answers she had imagined, this wasn't one of them. "Not afraid you'll hurt me," Maxwell continued, his eyes still locked on hers. "Afraid that if I kiss you, I won't be able to let go." He drew a deep breath, as if each word were being pulled from his chest by force. "And my world will swallow you. I've seen it happen. To my mother. She loved my father, and that world killed her. To others, people who tried to live normally beside men like me, they all get crushed." His voice hardened, but Rosalie could hear the pain beneath it. "I don't want you to be the next victim." Rosalie stood there, taking in what he had just said. He wasn't afraid she would hurt him. He was afraid he would hurt her. He was afraid his world would destroy her the way it had destroyed his mother. In that moment, she didn't see a powerful Mafia boss. She saw a man who had lost too much and feared losing more. "Do you ever want to live a different life?" she asked, her voice softer now. Maxwell turned his gaze to the dark window, to the streetlights blinking outside. "Every day," he said, distant. "But I don't get to choose. I was born into this world. I was shaped to lead it. I can't step out." "Everyone gets to choose," Rosalie said. Maxwell looked back at her, steel gray meeting her warm brown. "Do you really believe that?" "I have to," she said without hesitation. "If I didn't, I would have given up a long time ago. When I was in foster care, people told me I didn't have a choice. that my life was already decided, that an abandoned kid like me would never have anything. She smiled sadly. Then Maggie came, and I chose to believe her. I chose to let her into my life. That was my choice, and it changed everything. Silence. Maxwell watched her as if she had spoken a language he had never heard, yet somehow understood. "You're the first person who's ever said that to me and actually believed it," he said, his voice low and rough. They stood in the dark café, a few steps apart, neither of them moving. Streetlight cut across Maxwell's face, bringing out the curve of his jaw and the darkness in his eyes. Rosalie felt her heart slow, heavy, as if waiting for something. "I don't know how to do this," Maxwell said, his voice almost breaking. "Feelings, normal relationships. For 14 years, all I've known is orders, negotiations, and distance. I don't know how to let someone close without being afraid they'll get hurt." Rosalie gave a small smile, sad but understanding. "I don't know either. I've never let anyone stay close long enough to really know me." She paused. "Maybe we're both learning." Maxwell stepped forward, closing the space between them. He reached out and took her hand. His hand was warm and strong, but the way he touched her was so gentle it was almost hesitant, as if she were made of glass and he was afraid she would shatter. "I can't promise anything," he said, eyes straight on hers. "My world is dangerous. I have enemies. I have people who want to bring me down by any means. If you're with me, you'll become a target." Rosalie didn't pull her hand away. She looked at him, into those gray eyes holding fear and hope tangled together. "I know," she said, "but I'm still here." Maxwell looked at her for a long time, a very long time, as if trying to carve this moment into memory. Then he let go of her hand and stepped back. The distance opened between them, but this time it didn't feel like an abyss. It felt like an unspoken promise. "Good night, Rosalie." It was the first time he had used her name. Not Miss Thornton, polite and distant. Rosalie. Her name sounded from his lips like music, as if he had practiced saying it in his head many times before he dared to speak it out loud. Then he turned and walked out, the door closing behind him, leaving her alone in the dark cafe with her heart beating hard and the sense that everything had just changed forever. In a dark corner of Queens, in an office tucked deep behind an old seafood restaurant, Frank DeLuca sat behind his desk and stared at the wall across from him. Cigarette smoke curled around his head like a gray halo, and sickly yellow light fell over a hardened face, marked by a long scar that ran from the tail of his left eye down to the corner of his jaw. At 45, Frank had lived long enough to know patience was the strongest weapon, and he had been patient for 20 years. 20 years ago, Giuseppe Rinaldi had taken everything from the DeLuca family: territory, power, honor. Frank's father, Salvatore DeLuca, had once led one of the most influential families in Brooklyn, but Giuseppe had used strategy and force to crush them, taking street by street, business by business, connection by connection. Salvatore was arrested on a charge Frank had always believed Giuseppe had arranged, and he died in prison 3 years later, carrying shame Frank swore he would repay. Since then, Frank had rebuilt piece by piece, silently, patiently, waiting for the moment. And now, that moment was coming. The office door opened, and one of his closest men stepped in, bowing his head in greeting before coming up to the desk. Frank didn't look up. He only dragged in a breath of smoke and let it out slowly. "Boss, Maxwell Rinaldi has a weakness." For the first time in the conversation, Frank lifted his gaze. His dark eyes narrowed, lit with real interest. "Go on." "A girl. The owner of a small cafe in Little Italy. Her name is Rosalie Thornton." The man set a folder on the desk. "She saved Giuseppe Rinaldi's life a few weeks ago. A robbery. She stepped in front of a bullet for the old man." Frank raised an eyebrow, reached for the folder, and flipped through the pages. A photo of Rosalie. Information on the cafe, on Maggie, on Rosalie's history in the foster care system. "Maxwell goes to her cafe every night," the man continued. "No bodyguards, no armored car, just him, sitting for hours, drinking coffee, watching her work." Frank set the folder down, and a slow smile spread across his mouth. A smile that never reached his eyes, cold and calculating. "The little wolf has gone soft," he said with contempt. "Giuseppe turned him into an emotionless machine, And now a café waitress has cracked that wall. He gave a short laugh. How ironic. What do you want us to do with her? Frank was quiet for a moment, his fingers tapping lightly on the desktop. He wasn't in a rush. He had waited 20 years. A few more weeks meant nothing. Watch her, learn everything. Habits, schedule, weaknesses. He paused, drew in another drag of smoke. No action yet, just observe. When the time comes, she'll be our card. 1 week later, Maxwell sat in his Manhattan office, scanning financial reports when Dante walked in holding a white envelope. Boss, someone left this at the front desk. No sender. Maxwell frowned, took the envelope, and opened it. Inside was a photograph. Rosalie standing behind the counter at Maggie's Corner Cafe, a coffee pot in her hand. Her mouth caught mid-sentence as she spoke to a customer. The photo had been taken from across the street, through the cafe window. The angle showing the photographer had stood there for a long time, waiting for the perfect moment. With it was a small slip of paper, neat handwriting. Your weakness is beautiful. Maxwell's face didn't change. Not a muscle moved. But Dante, who had been at his side for 14 years, saw what made his blood turn cold. Maxwell's hand tightened around the photo so hard his knuckles went white. This wasn't the loud, explosive rage Dante had seen in other men. This was cold rage, controlled, and because of that, it was far more terrifying. The rage of someone willing to burn down the world. Double the protection on the cafe, Maxwell said, his voice calm in a way that was chilling. 24/7. Don't let Rosalie know. Boss, find out who sent this. Maxwell continued as if Dante hadn't spoken. I want to know everything about them. Name, address, family, habits, everything. Dante swallowed. Boss, if they're targeting her. Maxwell turned to him, gray eyes cold as steel. They won't touch her. Not a single hair. His voice dropped, more dangerous than any threat. And if they try, I'll personally make sure they regret being born into this world. A few days later, Rosalie began noticing things that didn't feel right. A man sitting across the street reading a newspaper for 3 hours. The same paper, the same posture. The car parked in front of the laundromat next door changed every day, but it was always the same kind of vehicle, the same glossy black. When she went out to buy supplies for the cafe, she felt someone trailing her from a distance. She wasn't imagining it. She had lived long enough to know when she was being watched. That night, when Maxwell walked in, Rosalie didn't greet him the way she usually did. She went straight to his table, planted both hands on the tabletop, and looked him directly in the eyes. What's going on? Maxwell looked up, his face giving nothing away. What are you talking about? Don't. Rosalie cut him off, her voice hard. The man reading the paper for 3 hours across the street. The car parked in front of the laundromat. The people following me when I go shopping. She tilted her head. You think I don't notice? Maxwell was silent for a moment, gray eyes on her with something almost like respect. He weighed a lie. She could see it in the way he drew a breath and hesitated before speaking. Then he let it out, as if surrendering an inner fight. Someone wants to use you to attack me. Rosalie went still. She had prepared for many answers, but not this one. Fear flashed openly in her eyes, cold and real. Not a vague worry, but the fear of someone who understands danger is close. But she didn't run. She didn't step back. She stood there looking at Maxwell, and in her gaze there was something he hadn't expected. Determination. Maxwell drew in a deep breath, his gray eyes never leaving Rosalie. He knew she deserved the truth, the whole truth, even if it sent her running, and she never came back. Frank DeLuca, he said, his voice low and steady. My family's rival. His father and my father have had bad blood for 20 years. My father took their territory, sent his father to prison, and Salvatore DeLuca died there. He paused, letting the words settle. Frank has been waiting for a chance to take revenge from that day until now, and he just found my weakness. Rosalie stayed still, absorbing each word. Weakness, she repeated, her voice flat. You're talking about me. Maxwell nodded, not trying to hide it. He knows about you. He knows I care about you. He knows I come here every night. His hand clenched into a fist on the tabletop. He'll use you to pressure me, to force me into bad decisions, or worse. Fear rose in Rosalie, cold and real. She thought of Maggie upstairs, of the cafe her mother had built for 30 years, of the ordinary life she had been trying to hold together. All of it could be destroyed because she had saved an old man on a rainy night. But she didn't panic. She had lived through too much to panic over a threat that hadn't happened yet. "So what am I supposed to do?" she asked, her voice steadier than she expected. "Hide? Close the cafe? Leave my mother behind and run somewhere no one knows me?" Maxwell stood, facing her. "You should stay away from me," he said, each word sounding like it had to be forced out of his chest. "Being near me is dangerous. I told you that from the beginning. If you cut contact with me, if I stop coming here, Frank won't have a reason to target you." Silence fell between them, heavy and tight. Rosalie looked at Maxwell, into gray eyes holding pain he was trying to hide. He was pushing her away. He was trying to protect her by leaving her, and part of her wanted to accept it, wanted to go back to the normal life she had before all of this. But the other part, the larger part, the part that had stepped in front of a gun for a stranger without thinking, refused. "Did you ask what I want?" Maxwell looked surprised, his brow creasing. "What do you want?" Rosalie stepped closer, not backing up, not lowering her eyes. "I want you to stop deciding for me." Her voice was firm, each word pressed out clearly. "I've spent my whole life with other people deciding for me. The foster care system decided where I lived. Foster families decided who I was. Fate decided what I got." She stopped and took a breath. "You are not going to do that to me. You don't get to decide whether I should stay away from you. That's my decision." Maxwell went still, unable to speak. In every scenario he had imagined, this wasn't one of them. He had thought she would be afraid, thought she would blame him for dragging her into this dangerous world, thought she would beg him to protect her or run as far as possible. But she didn't do any of that. She stood in front of him, brown eyes bright with determination, demanding the right to decide her own life. "Do you understand what the consequences could be?" he asked, his voice low. "Frank DeLuca isn't a man who jokes. If he decides to act, you could get hurt. Or worse. Your mother, this cafe, everything could be affected." "I know," Rosalie said without hesitation, "but that's my decision, not yours." Maxwell looked at her, truly looked, and for the first time he didn't see a girl who needed protecting. He saw a strong woman, unbreakable, someone who had lived through hell and still stood upright. He saw an equal, someone choosing to stand beside him not because she needed him, but because she wanted to. "You're not like anyone I've ever met, Rosalie." Rosalie smiled, a small smile but real. "I'll take that as a compliment." "It is a compliment," Maxwell said, and his mouth curved into a smile, the first real smile she had seen on his face since they met. They stood there for a moment, looking at each other in the quiet, empty cafe. Then Maxwell spoke again, his voice softer, like a promise. "I'll increase protection, but you'll be told everything. No hiding it. No deciding for you." He paused. "That's our new deal." Rosalie nodded. "That's what I want." They looked at each other, and in that moment, a new agreement formed. Not an agreement between protector and protected, an agreement between two equals, two people choosing to face danger together. "You really aren't afraid?" Maxwell asked, a note of genuine curiosity in his voice. Rosalie looked at him, brown eyes deep and honest. I'm afraid every day," she admitted. "But I've lived my whole life in fear. Afraid of being abandoned, afraid of losing Maggie, afraid of not having enough money to pay the bills. Fear is an old friend of mine." She gave a faint smile. "It doesn't stop me. It never has." At 9:45 p.m., Rosalie flipped the sign to close the way she did every day. The cafe had been empty for half an hour, and she used the time to clean, wipe the tables, stack the chairs so she could mop the floor in the morning. Upstairs, Maggie was sleeping soundly, her health noticeably steadier thanks to the new treatment. The doctor had said there was hope, and that was a word Rosalie hadn't dared to think about for months. She grabbed the trash bag and headed for the back door to take it out to the bin in the alley. A task she had done hundreds of times, so ordinary it didn't require a thought. She pushed open the back door and stepped into the dark alley. The streetlight at the corner had been smashed, shards of glass still scattered across the ground. Rosalie stopped, the survival instinct she had developed during her foster care years suddenly sounding an alarm. Something wasn't right. Then they appeared. 3 dark figures stepped out from the shadowed corner of the alley, moving slowly, deliberately. Rosalie dropped the trash bag and backed toward the door, but they were faster. 2 of them cut off her path back to the cafe. The third blocked the way out to the main street. "Miss Thornton," The man in the middle spoke, his voice flat, like he was reading from a script. "Mr. DeLuca sends his regards." Rosalie froze. Her blood seemed to turn to ice, her heart beating wildly in her chest. She thought about screaming, but her throat locked dry. She thought about running, but her legs wouldn't move. Fear paralyzed her completely for a moment that felt as long as a lifetime, but they didn't touch her. Instead, the leader signaled, and the other two moved around her toward the cafe's back door. They shoved it open and went inside. Rosalie turned, her feet finally obeying, and she ran after them into the cafe, and she could only stand there and watch while they destroyed everything. The first man swung a baseball bat across the cash register, coins and bills exploding into the air. The second kicked over tables and chairs, the sound of splintering wood cracking like bones. They smashed the front windows, glass raining down onto the floor. The coffee machine Rosalie had coaxed into working every morning was kicked to the ground, shattering into pieces. The refrigerator was tipped, food spilling across the tiles. And then, as if none of that was enough, one of them walked to Maggie's handwritten menu board, the board that had hung on the wall for 30 years, and ripped it down, shattered the frame, tore the papers inside into small pieces. Rosalie stood there, helpless, watching 30 years of her mother's memories get destroyed in 5 minutes. Tears ran down her cheeks, but she didn't cry out loud. She had cried too much in her life to have any strength left for this. When they had wrecked everything they could wreck, the leader turned and looked at her. He didn't smile, didn't threaten her with theatrics. He only stared with eyes as cold as someone studying a pawn on a chessboard. "Tell Rinaldi this is only the beginning," he said, his voice flat. "Next time, it won't be just the cafe." Then they vanished into the darkness, as quickly as they had appeared. Rosalie heard footsteps pounding into the alley seconds later, the shouts of Maxwell's security team arriving too late. But she didn't care. She only stood in the middle of the ruins, looking around at what had once been Maggie's corner cafe. The worn linoleum floor was now covered in broken glass. The cracked vinyl chairs were overturned, chair legs snapped and scattered. Maggie's handwritten menu, the lettering slanting to the right as if always reaching for something, was now only torn scraps on the floor. 30 years. 30 years her mother had built this place, brick by brick, chair by chair, recipe by recipe, and it had all been destroyed in 5 minutes. Rosalie didn't cry. She slowly sat down in the middle of the wreckage, her back against the shattered counter, and stared at nothing in front of her. She had no tears left. She had no strength left to scream. She only sat there, numb, hollow. 15 minutes later, hurried footsteps came, and Maxwell burst through the front door that had been smashed open. He stopped dead in the doorway, took in the ruined cafe, then saw Rosalie sitting among the broken glass. His face changed. Not the cold, controlled anger she had seen when he received the photograph. This was something deeper, more primal. Fear. For the first time in her life, Rosalie saw Maxwell Rinaldi afraid. Not afraid for himself. Afraid of losing her. He rushed to her, dropped to his knees in the broken glass without caring about his pants or his skin. He pulled her up with hands that were strong but careful, checking her for injuries. When he saw she wasn't physically hurt, he drew her into his arms and held her tight, as if she might disappear if he let go. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice shaking, rough. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry." Rosalie didn't speak. She only leaned into him, letting the weight of her body be held by him, letting the clean, masculine scent of his cologne, mixed with his anxious sweat, wrap around her. This was the first time he had held her, not in the warm cafe under soft yellow light, but in the ashes and shards of everything she had ever had. "I'm taking you and your mother somewhere safe," Maxwell said, his voice hardening again. Decisive. "Tonight. No one stays here." Rosalie nodded. This time she didn't argue. She didn't have the strength. She let Maxwell guide her out of the cafe, through the broken doorway, to the waiting car surrounded by security. Before she got in, she turned back and looked at Maggie's corner cafe one last time. The cafe stood in darkness, its glass shattered, the inside black and ruined. 30 years of memories, the place Maggie had built her life, the place where Rosalie had found home. Now it was nothing but wreckage. The house sat deep in a quiet Long Island neighborhood, far from the city's noise. High walls wrapped around a wide garden lined with old trees, and security stood watch 24/7 at every corner. This was one of the Rinaldi family's safe places, a place very few outsiders even knew existed. Maxwell had brought Rosalie and Maggie here the very night the café was attacked. Maggie had been driven in a separate car, still drowsy from the sleeping medicine Rosalie had given her before everything happened. She didn't know about the café. Not yet. The next morning, Rosalie woke in an unfamiliar room with white curtains and sunlight slipping through the gap. She lay still for a while, staring at the ceiling, trying to process everything that had happened. The café in ruins. 30 years of memories destroyed in 5 minutes. Frank DeLuca's threat echoing in her head. Next time, it won't be just the café. She knew she should be afraid. She knew she should run, but strangely, the strongest thing she felt right now wasn't fear. It was exhaustion. Bone-deep exhaustion. She went downstairs and found Maggie awake, sitting in the living room with Maxwell. They were talking, and when Rosalie walked in, both of them fell silent. She looked at her mother, then at Maxwell, feeling as if she were stepping into something important. "My girl." Maggie lifted a hand and beckoned her over. "Come here." Rosalie sat beside her mother, and Maggie turned toward Maxwell. She looked at him with the eyes of someone seasoned, someone who had lived long enough to see every kind of person this world could offer. "You're the man Rosalie mentioned," she said, not as a question. Maxwell nodded. "Ma'am, I'm sorry I pulled your daughter into this. The café." Maggie raised a hand, cutting him off. "I've heard about the café," she said, her voice so calm it startled Rosalie. "Rosalie told me this morning." She was quiet for a moment, studying Maxwell with eyes still sharp even though sickness had left her body fragile. Then she spoke, gentle but certain. "You love my daughter." Not a question, a statement. Maxwell didn't deny it. He only looked at Maggie, then at Rosalie, gray eyes deep with feeling he didn't know how to turn into words. Maggie nodded, as if that was all she needed to know. "Let me speak with my daughter alone," she said to Maxwell. "You have things you need to do, don't you?" Maxwell stood, nodded to her, and left the room. Rosalie watched him until he disappeared through the doorway, then turned back to her mother. The two of them went out into the garden and sat on a bench beneath the shade of a tree. The morning sun was soft, a light breeze carrying the scent of flowers and fresh grass. A morning so beautiful it was almost cruel, after everything that had happened the night before. "You're scared, aren't you?" Maggie asked, her voice gentle. Rosalie didn't answer right away. She looked down at her hands, fingers still scratched from broken glass the night before. "His world is dangerous, Mom," she said at last. "I don't know if I belong in it. I'm just a café waitress. I don't know how to live in a world of guns and threats and men like Frank DeLuca." Maggie took her daughter's hand, her own thin and trembling but still warm. "My girl, I'm going soon." "Mom." Rosalie tried to cut her off, tried to say no. She would be fine. The treatment was working. But Maggie tightened her grip, telling her to be quiet. "I know my body, sweetheart. The treatment is giving me more time, but it isn't a miracle." Maggie smiled sadly. "I'm not afraid to die. I've lived a good life. I had the café. I had customers who loved me. And most of all, I had you." She lifted a hand and smoothed Rosalie's hair the way she had when Rosalie was 15 and newly adopted. "The only thing I'm afraid of is you being alone after I'm gone." Tears rose in Rosalie's eyes, but she held them back. "Don't be afraid to love someone just because you're afraid of losing them," Maggie went on, her voice as certain as it had been when she taught Rosalie about life. "If I'd lived that way, I would have never adopted you. I knew you could be taken from me at any time. I knew you might never love me back. I knew everything could fall apart, but I still chose to love you." She smiled, "And it was the best decision of my life." At the same time, in a private hospital in Manhattan, Maxwell sat beside his father's bed. Giuseppe had been weakening quickly in recent days, as if his strength were draining away bit by bit. His skin was pale, his breathing heavy, but his eyes were still sharp as ever. "Are you happy?" Giuseppe asked, his voice rough. Maxwell was silent. He didn't know how to answer. He wasn't sure he even knew what happiness was. Giuseppe sighed. "That girl, Rosalie, she's your light. I've seen the way you look at her, the way you worry about her." He reached out and took his son's hand with trembling fingers. "Don't let that light go out because you're afraid of your own darkness." "Dad, I was wrong to teach you that love is weakness," Giuseppe cut in, his eyes shining. "I lost your mother and I was afraid. I built walls around your heart because I didn't want you to hurt the way I did, but it only made you lonely." He squeezed Maxwell's hand. You're stronger than I ever was, Maxwell. Because you can still love. Don't waste that. That afternoon, Maxwell drove back to the Long Island house, his father's words still echoing in his head. Don't let that light go out. You're stronger than I am. You can still love. The words of a man about to leave, words with nothing left to hide, nothing left to lose. Rosalie stood at the living room window, staring out at the garden, when she heard a car stop. Her mother's words still echoed in her mind. Don't be afraid to love someone just because you're afraid of losing them. If I'd lived that way, I would have never adopted you. She turned as Maxwell stepped into the house. He stopped in the doorway and looked at her, and their eyes met. Neither of them spoke. But in that moment, something changed. They had both heard the same advice from two people who were close to leaving. Don't be afraid to love. And maybe, just maybe, it was time they listened. The Rinaldi office sat on the top floor of a Manhattan building, a place only the most powerful were allowed to enter. 8 men sat around a long oak table, each of them in an expensive suit, each of them holding enough power to alter the fate of hundreds of people with a single nod. They were the highest ranks in the Rinaldi organization, men who had followed Giuseppe since he was young, men who had watched Maxwell grow up and take control. Dante stood in the corner near the door, his worried gaze fixed on Maxwell at the head of the table. The air was so tense it felt like it could be cut with a knife. The oldest man, white-haired and weathered with the wrinkles of hard years, spoke first. Maxwell, we respect you. You've led the family well for the past 14 years. Your father is proud of you. He paused and looked around the table as if seeking agreement before continuing. But that girl is a problem. Another man picked up the thread, his voice sharper. Frank DeLuca is using her to attack us. The café being destroyed was only the first step. He's testing us, watching how we react. He set a stack of documents on the table. There's damage. Not just the café. Some of our business partners are starting to worry. They're hearing rumors that Maxwell Rinaldi has a weakness. Cut her off, the third man said, cold and practical. That's the simplest solution. No girl, no weakness. DeLuca loses his card, and we go on as normal. Or at least, the fourth man added, send her far away, permanently. Europe, South America, anywhere. Give her money and a new identity. She'll have a good life, and we won't have a problem. Maxwell sat in silence while they spoke. He looked at them one by one. Familiar faces he had known since he was a child. They weren't his enemies. They were allies, advisors, men who had protected the Rinaldi family through every storm. And they weren't wrong. Tactically, they were right. Rosalie was a weakness. Cutting her off was the most logical, safest, smartest move. It was what the Maxwell of 14 years ago would have done without thinking. But the Maxwell of now wasn't that man anymore. In that silence, memory surged in like a tide. He remembered Rosalie stepping in front of a gun for his father, a complete stranger, for no reason except pure kindness. He remembered the night at the hospital, the sound of her crying into the phone, the choking sobs of someone too familiar with loneliness. He remembered the way she smiled when she taught him to say please, the first smile she had given him, warm and real enough that he didn't know what to do with it. He remembered the feeling of holding her in the wreckage of the café, the way she leaned into him as if he were the only anchor left in the world, the way his own heart had hammered with fear, not fear for himself, but fear of losing her. For 14 years, he had lived for the organization. For 14 years, he had put the Rinaldi family above everything, even himself. For 14 years, he had built walls around his heart and called it strength. But for the first time in those 14 years, he wanted to live for something else, for someone else. I choose her. Maxwell's voice landed in the silent room, clear and steady. All 8 men looked up at once, shock on their faces. I will keep my responsibilities as leader, Maxwell continued, his eyes moving across each of them. But my personal life is not a subject for negotiation. He stood, both hands braced on the table, his posture radiating absolute authority. Rosalie Thornton is under the protection of the Rinaldi family, permanently. Anyone who touches her will answer to me, directly. Silence. Then whispers began. Uneasy glances traded back and forth. The white-haired man spoke again, cautious. Maxwell, this will make you look weak to DeLuca. He'll think you're letting emotion drive your decisions. Maxwell met his gaze, gray eyes cold as steel, hard as diamond. If DeLuca thinks I'm weak, he can test me. His voice dropped, dangerous, edged with threat. I promise he won't like the result. No one dared say more. Maxwell straightened, adjusted the button of his suit jacket, and walked out without looking back. Dante followed at once, silent until the elevator doors slid closed behind them. "Boss," Dante said as the elevator began to descend, "you just put everything on the line. Your position, their confidence, everything." Maxwell stared straight ahead, his face giving nothing away. "I know. If DeLuca hits back, if she gets hurt, they'll say they told you so. You could lose everything." Maxwell turned to Dante, and for a brief moment Dante saw something in his boss's eyes he had never seen before. Not the familiar coldness, something else. The resolve of a man who had found something worth fighting for. "And I'll win." 2 days after the meeting at the Rinaldi office, Maxwell reached out to Commissioner Harrison Walsh, a mediator both families respected. Walsh had done this work for 30 years, connecting people who couldn't speak directly, arranging meetings where a single wrong word could lead to bloodshed. Maxwell proposed a meeting with Frank DeLuca, neutral ground, no weapons, no bodyguards in the room. Frank agreed almost immediately, and Maxwell knew why. He was curious. He wanted to see with his own eyes the wolf he believed had been tamed by a café waitress. The old Italian restaurant sat on a quiet Brooklyn corner, the kind of family place that had survived 3 generations and knew how to keep secrets. The owner closed the restaurant for the meeting, asked no questions, simply retreated to the kitchen and waited. Walsh sat at the head of the long table, an aged face but eyes still sharp, the eyes of a man who had seen too much. Maxwell sat on one side, Frank DeLuca sat on the other. No bodyguards in the room, that was the rule. Only 3 men, and the heavy tension in the air. Frank DeLuca looked older than 45, the scar on his left cheek tightening as he smiled, a smile that didn't touch his cold eyes. "Maxwell Rinaldi, the Grey Wolf's son. Finally you're willing to meet me." He leaned back, hands resting comfortably on the tabletop. "I hear you have a woman. That little cafe owner in Little Italy." He gave a short laugh, voice thick with contempt. "Your father would be ashamed if he were still alive." The great Rinaldi, head of one of the most powerful families on the East Coast, tied down by a waitress. Maxwell sat still, his face giving nothing away. He had heard words like this his whole life, baited insults, deliberate provocation, attempts to find the crack. He didn't bite. "Frank," he said, his voice calm as water without a ripple, "your father lost 20 years ago. You've been waiting since then to take revenge." He tilted his head, looking at Frank with a gaze that saw too much. "I understand. I don't blame you. If I were in your place, I might do the same." He paused, letting the words settle. "But you made a mistake when you touched her." Frank laughed loudly, the sound echoing in the empty restaurant. "A mistake? You think I'm afraid of you, Maxwell?" He leaned forward, his eyes bright with cruel amusement. "You think because you're Giuseppe Rinaldi's son I should shake? I've waited 20 years. I'm not in a hurry." Maxwell didn't flinch. He leaned forward too, closing the distance, and when he spoke his voice dropped, solid as steel. "No. I don't think you're afraid of me. I think you should be afraid." Silence. Frank's brow tightened, the smile fading slightly. "You fight for hatred," Maxwell continued, each word measured. 20 years of hatred, but hatred is something that can cool, can be beaten, can be bought. He looked straight into Frank's eyes, unblinking. "I fight to protect the person I love, and that is something that never cools, never gets beaten, never gets bought." Frank said nothing, eyes narrowing. "You can lose this war and still live," Maxwell said. "You have territory, money, a future. Losing to me isn't the end of you." He paused. "I don't. If I lose her, I lose everything. Who do you think will go farther? The man who has something to lose, or the man who has nothing left to lose?" Tense silence hung between them. Frank stared into Maxwell's eyes, and for the first time in the meeting something shifted on his face. Not fear. Frank DeLuca had lived too long in this world to fear easily. But hesitation, recalculation. He had expected to meet a weak man, someone blinded by feeling. Instead, he saw something far more dangerous. Absolute certainty. A willingness to sacrifice everything. The kind of opponent no one wants, The kind of man you can't threaten because he has accepted every consequence already. Here's my offer, Maxwell said, his voice still calm but hard as steel. Stay away from Rosalie Thornton. Stay away from the Rinaldi family. You keep your territory, I keep mine. No one touches anyone. We end this here. Frank didn't speak, his gaze locked on Maxwell. Or, Maxwell went on, you refuse, and I will come for you. No mediator, no rules, no limits. He leaned back, as if he had offered dinner instead of a life and death threat. Choose. Frank DeLuca sat silent for a long moment. He wanted to laugh it off, to refuse, to show Maxwell he couldn't be threatened. But when he looked into those gray eyes, he saw the truth. This wasn't empty talk. Maxwell Rinaldi was completely serious, and he had the power to carry out what he promised. Fine, Frank said at last, his voice stiff and reluctant. That girl isn't worth my time. He stood and straightened his suit jacket. But don't forget, Rinaldi. I still remember what your father did to my family. I'll never forget. Maxwell nodded. I don't expect you to forget. But I'm choosing to end it here. The question is whether you're wise enough to do the same. Frank didn't answer. He turned and walked out of the restaurant. No handshake, no glance back. The door slammed behind him, and the room sank into silence. Walsh, who had sat wordless through the exchange, let out a long breath. You took a big gamble, Maxwell. A very big one. Maxwell stood and buttoned his suit jacket, and I won. He walked out into the Brooklyn afternoon sun. The war was over. No blood. No more loss. Rosalie was safe. And for the first time in weeks, Maxwell felt like he could breathe. Rosalie sat on the front steps of the safe house, looking out over the wide garden, the rows of green trees glowing under the afternoon sun. She had been here almost a week, and even though she knew it was safe, she still felt like a stranger inside her own life. The wreckage of the café haunted her every night. Broken glass, torn scraps of the menu, 30 years of her mother's memories turned into rubble. She heard footsteps behind her, and didn't need to turn to know who it was. Maxwell sat down beside her on the steps and said nothing for a moment. They both looked out at the garden, letting silence fill the space between them. Then Maxwell spoke, his voice softer than usual. Frank DeLuca backed off. You're safe now. Rosalie turned to look at him, brown eyes searching for truth in his words. What did you do? I negotiated, Maxwell said, still looking ahead. No one got hurt. He won't touch you or my family anymore. Rosalie didn't ask for details. She knew there were parts of his world she didn't need, and maybe shouldn't know. She only nodded, feeling some of the weight on her shoulders finally lift. Maxwell pulled a paper folder from his jacket and set it on his lap. I want to offer you something, he said, with a hesitation Rosalie had never heard from him before. Not charity. This is an investment. Rosalie frowned, looking at the folder. We rebuild the café, Maxwell continued. Together. 50-50. She opened the folder. Inside were partnership contracts, design drawings for Maggie's Corner Cafe, a construction budget broken down into every single line item. She turned the pages, her eyes widening with each one. I don't have the money to put in 50%, she said, her voice rough. I don't have anything. Maxwell turned to her, and his gray eyes softened in a way that was unusual for him. You bring 30 years of the cafe's history, your mother's recipes, your dedication, everything you and Maggie built. He paused. That's your 50%. It's worth more than money. Rosalie stared at him, not sure what to say. This wasn't what she had expected. She had prepared for him to offer her money, offer protection, offer things she would refuse because she didn't want to owe anyone. But this was different. This was partnership. Equal. Why are you doing this? She asked carefully. Maxwell was quiet for a moment, as if weighing the answer. Then he spoke, low and sincere enough to make Rosalie's heart beat faster. Because I want to build something with you. Something clean. Something that has nothing to do with my world. He looked out at the garden, but his eyes were far away, as if he were staring at a future he didn't quite dare to believe in. That cafe, it represents what I want to move toward. A normal life. He turned and looked at her. With you. Rosalie felt her breath catch. This was the first time Maxwell had spoken directly about a future for them together. No half hints, no avoidance. He wanted a normal life. With her. She looked down at the papers in her hands, then back at Maxwell. Her whole life, She had learned not to trust anyone but Maggie. Her whole life, she had built walls around herself so she wouldn't get hurt. But sitting here beside this man, she realized sometimes walls don't protect you. They only imprison you. "All right," she said, her voice steady. "But I want to be involved in every decision. From the paint color to the kind of coffee we use. Everything." Maxwell smiled, the real smile she had started to love. "I wouldn't expect anything else." 2 months later, Maggie's Corner Cafe opened again. Same location, the quiet corner in Little Italy, tucked between the old bakery and the antique shop. But the cafe had been brought back to life. New linoleum floors, the same color as the old ones but without the worn paths. New vinyl chairs, the same style but without the cracks. A handwritten menu hung on the wall, Maggie's letters slanting to the right as if reaching for something, rewritten carefully during her recovery days. A new shiny coffee machine stood behind the counter, the lighting warmer, the kitchen upgraded with modern equipment, and on the wall near the entrance, a framed photograph. Maggie on the day she opened the cafe 30 years earlier, young and full of hope, standing in front of the door with a bright smile. On opening day, Maggie came downstairs to the cafe for the first time in months. Her health had stabilized noticeably, and the doctors said she could live many more years if she kept up the treatment and got enough rest. She walked in with Rosalie supporting her, her older eyes moving over the room, touching every detail, as if touching a dream she had thought she had lost forever. She sat down at the familiar corner table by the window, where she had sat thousands of times over 30 years. Tears shimmered in Maggie's eyes. "You saved it," she said to Rosalie, her voice trembling. "You saved my dream." Rosalie knelt beside her mother and held her tight. "Not by myself, Mom." Through the cafe window, Maxwell stood outside, talking with the crew finishing the last details. He wasn't wearing a suit today, only a rolled-sleeve shirt, his hair a little messy from the wind. He looked more ordinary, more human, as if this small cafe had begun to change him. Maggie followed her daughter's gaze and saw the way Rosalie looked at Maxwell, and she smiled. The smile of a mother who knows her daughter has found something precious. The smile of someone who can leave this world without fearing her daughter will be alone. 1 week after opening day, the cafe had slowly returned to its normal rhythm. Old customers came back, familiar neighborhood faces stopping in to congratulate them and drink a cup of coffee. Maggie was able to come downstairs each afternoon, sitting in her usual corner, watching her daughter work with a satisfied smile on her lips. And Maxwell still came every night, sitting at the table where Giuseppe had once sat, as if it had become an essential part of his life. That night, the cafe was closed. Maggie had gone upstairs to rest early, her health better but still needing plenty of sleep. Rosalie was wiping down the counter, the familiar work she had done 1,000 times, while Maxwell sat at the corner table, a cup of coffee gone cold in front of him. He didn't drink. He only sat there, watching her. Streetlight spilled through the front windows, casting long bands of light and shadow across the new floor. The cafe sank into stillness. Only the soft drag of the cloth against the counter and the sound of their breathing. Rosalie heard a chair scrape, footsteps coming closer. She looked up and saw Maxwell standing right in front of her, only a counter away. He moved around and came to stand beside her, and in that moment the air between them changed. Heavier, closer. Maxwell reached out and took her hand. Gentle, deliberate, but not forcing. His hand was warm and strong, closing around her smaller one, as if he were holding something precious. This was the first time he touched her not to protect her, not to comfort her, not out of worry, but because he wanted to. "Rosalie," he said, his voice low and rough. She lifted her eyes, brown meeting gray. In the dim cafe light, his eyes weren't cold steel anymore. They were warmer, softer, full of feelings he had kept hidden for so many years. "I don't know how to love someone the right way," Maxwell said, each word drawn up from somewhere deep inside him. "I never learned. For 14 years, all I've known is orders and distance. I know how to make people afraid. I know how to make people respect me, but I don't know how to make someone love me." He paused, his gaze locked on hers. "But with you, I want to learn." Rosalie felt her heart beat faster, harder. She looked at the man standing in front of her, the most powerful man she had ever met, opening himself to her in a way he might never have done with anyone else. "I don't know either," she said, her voice light as breath. I've never let anyone stay close long enough to find out. I've always been afraid that if I let them in, they'll see the cracks and leave, like everyone before. She squeezed his hand gently. But with you, I want to try. Maxwell looked at her, and in that moment every wall between them fell away. He leaned in, slowly, giving her time to pull back if she wanted. But Rosalie didn't pull back. She stayed still, lifted her face, and waited. Their lips met, gentle, hesitant, like two people learning how to trust for the first time. There were no fireworks, no romantic music, only the warmth of a kiss, the lingering scent of coffee in the air, and the sense that a door had just opened for both of them. The kiss lasted only a few seconds, but it changed everything. It was a promise that didn't need words, a confirmation that they had chosen each other. When they parted, Maxwell rested his forehead against hers, eyes still closed. His breath was warm against her cheek. "Are you sure?" he whispered. "My world is still dangerous. Frank DeLuca backing off doesn't mean there won't be other enemies. Being with me means living with risks most people can't even imagine." Rosalie opened her eyes and looked into his gray eyes only inches from her own. "No," she said, honest. "I'm not sure about anything. I'm not sure about the future. I'm not sure whether this is the right decision." She gave a faint smile. "But I still choose you." Maxwell smiled. A real smile. Unguarded. Uncalculated. The smile of a man who had just found what he didn't know he was looking for. "That's enough for me." They stood there in the dark café, hand in hand, forehead to forehead. Outside the windows, the city was still loud with traffic and voices. The world kept turning, still dangerous, still full of things no one could predict. But in this moment, nothing else mattered. Only them. Two people too familiar with pain, daring for the first time to believe in happiness. Two people who had built walls around their hearts their whole lives, choosing for the first time to open the door. And that choice, imperfect, risky, was enough. 3 months had passed since that first kiss in the dark cafe. 3 months of evenings together, breakfasts with Maggie, small moments that both Maxwell and Rosalie held close, as if they might vanish at any time. But while their life was blooming, Giuseppe Rinaldi's health was fading like a candle near the end of its wick. He no longer had the strength to come to the cafe, not even the strength to leave his hospital bed. Maxwell visited his father every day, sitting beside him in the quiet hospital room, listening to the steady beep of the monitor and the weakening breath of the man who had once made all of Brooklyn tremble. Giuseppe knew his time was short. He could feel it in every aching bone, in every breath that grew heavier. One afternoon, as Maxwell sat at the bedside like always, Giuseppe opened his eyes and said in a hoarse, faint voice, "I want to see her. One more time." Maxwell didn't need to ask who he meant. He nodded, pulled out his phone, and called Rosalie. An hour later she arrived at the hospital, stepping into the room with her heart pounding and her eyes red from crying on the way there. She knew what this meant. This was goodbye. Giuseppe lay in the bed, his skin so pale it was nearly translucent, but his eyes still brightened when he saw her. He motioned for her to come closer, and Rosalie sat down in the chair beside Maxwell, facing the dying old man. Giuseppe looked at his son, the man he had raised with hardness and discipline, the man he had never allowed to be weak. "My son," he said, his voice trembling but full of feeling. "I was wrong about many things in my life. I did things I'm not proud of, but my greatest mistake was teaching you that love is weakness." He paused, dragging in a heavy breath. "Look at you now. You're stronger than I ever was. Because you can still love. Because you chose to love. I couldn't do that. After your mother died, I locked my heart and turned you into a man like me." Tears slipped from the corners of his wrinkled eyes. "I'm sorry, Maxwell. I'm sorry I stole your childhood. I'm sorry I never taught you how to love." Maxwell gripped his father's hand, knuckles white from the pressure. He said nothing, because he didn't trust his voice now. His eyes were wet, but he didn't let the tears fall. Not because he didn't want to cry, but because he had forgotten how a long time ago. Giuseppe turned to Rosalie, his older eyes softening as they rested on her. "Rosalie, you saved me twice," he said, his voice weak but full of gratitude. "The first time in the cafe, when you stepped between a gun and a strange old man. You didn't know who I was. You had no reason to risk your life, but you did it anyway." He paused, eyes shining. "The second time you saved my son. He'd been dead inside for a long time, Rosalie. Since his mother died, he was only a walking body. doing everything I demanded without asking why. I thought I'd lost him forever. He smiled faintly. But you brought him back. You gave him a reason to live, not just survive. Rosalie felt the tears break loose, unstoppable. She took Giuseppe's thin hand, feeling the cold, bony skin beneath her fingers. I'll take care of him, she said through her sobs. I promise. Giuseppe smiled, then reached out with his other hand, took Maxwell's hand, and placed their hands together. His old hand covered his son's and his future daughter-in-law's, holding tight as if he were passing on everything he had left. Take care of each other, he said, each word like a prayer. That's the only thing I ask. Don't repeat my mistakes. Don't let pain turn into a wall. Love each other, no matter how frightening it is. Yes, Father, Maxwell said, his voice thick and rough. Giuseppe smiled, his eyes slowly closing as if he could finally rest. Now I can go see your mother, he whispered. She's waited too long for me. That night, Giuseppe Rinaldi died in his sleep, peaceful and without pain. The gray wolf of Brooklyn had finished his journey. Maxwell didn't cry in front of anyone. He arranged the funeral, greeted the mourners, did everything a son was supposed to do with the familiar mask on his face. But at 3 o'clock in the morning, when Rosalie woke and found the bed beside her empty, she knew where to find him. She went down to the café, pushed the door open, and saw Maxwell sitting alone in the dark, at the very table where Giuseppe had once sat. He wasn't crying, but his shoulders sagged, and when she drew closer, she saw those gray eyes empty in a way they had never been before. Rosalie didn't speak. She only sat beside him, took his hand, and stayed. They sat in silence until the first light of morning came through the windows. The funeral took place 3 days later, small and private, only family and the closest inner circle. Rosalie stood beside Maxwell all day, hand in hand, saying nothing but always there. He didn't speak a single word all day. But that night, after everyone had gone, after the house had fallen into silence, Maxwell turned to Rosalie. Thank you, he said, his voice raw. For being here. Rosalie squeezed his hand. I'll always be here. Sometimes loving someone isn't about beautiful words or grand gestures. Sometimes loving someone is as simple as sitting beside them in silence, when what they need most is to know they aren't alone. 1 year after that fateful rainy night in Little Italy, Maggie's Corner Cafe was filled with sunlight and laughter. Sunday brunch was always the busiest time of the week, when neighborhood families stopped by for a late breakfast, when young couples came in to drink coffee and read the paper, when the whole world seemed to slow down just a little to enjoy simple things. The scent of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the smell of bread straight from the oven, drifting through the room, while sunlight poured through the windows and fell across the new linoleum floor, making warm stripes of light that seemed to dance with the rhythm of footsteps coming and going. Maggie sat at her familiar corner table by the window, the morning paper open in front of her, a cup of green tea steaming softly beside it. Her health had stabilized remarkably, and the doctors said she could live many more years if she continued to keep to her treatment plan and rest. She didn't work in the cafe anymore, but she still came down every day, sitting in this corner, watching the result of 30 years of her life. Now and then she lifted her eyes from the paper, looking around the cafe with a satisfied smile on her lips. 30 years ago, she opened this place with a small amount of savings and a big dream. Now that dream was still alive, stronger than ever, passed on to the next generation. Maxwell came to the cafe every morning, sitting at the very table where his father had sat for 8 months before everything began. He still ran the Rinaldi family's business, but he had started the slow process of handing it off, a long, complicated road of stepping back from the world he had been born into. It wasn't something that could happen overnight. It might take years, but for the first time in his life, he had a goal beyond maintaining power. Today he was behind the counter, struggling with the espresso machine like a complete amateur. After a year of trying to learn how to make coffee, he was still astonishingly bad at it. Pour it slowly, don't dump it in. Rosalie called from the other side of the counter, where she was arranging loaves of bread in the display case. Maxwell grimaced, but his mouth curved into a smile. The kind of smile that, a year ago, no one would have believed he could wear. A real smile, unguarded, uncalculated. The smile of a man who had found a reason to be happy. Rosalie stood behind the counter, her hair pinned up neatly, her white apron dusted with a few streaks of flour from baking early that morning. She laughed more now, easier, more naturally. Her laughter moved through the cafe like a familiar melody, blending with the chatter of customers, and the soft music playing from an old radio. Watching Maxwell wrestle with the coffee machine, she shook her head, but her eyes shone with happiness. For the first time in her life, she had something that felt like a real family. Not a family made by blood or paperwork, but a family made by choice, by love, by people deciding to stay beside one another no matter how hard life got. Maxwell looked up from the cup of coffee he had just made and caught Rosalie's gaze from across the counter. They held each other's eyes, and in that moment, the whole world seemed to stop. $240, he said softly, low enough that only she could hear. That's all the robbers wanted that night. Rosalie laughed, a smile bright enough to light her whole face, and look where it led. Maxwell set the coffee down and came around the counter to her. He took her hand, his fingers weaving into hers as naturally as if they had been doing it their whole lives. It led to home, he said, his voice low and sincere. It led me home. The cafe stayed noisy, warm, alive around them. Maggie read her paper in her familiar corner, occasionally glancing at her daughter and the man beside her with a satisfied smile. Maxwell kept learning how to make coffee, still clumsy but patient. Rosalie served customers, laughing and talking with the familiar neighborhood faces. An imperfect family, built from people who had been hurt, who had been lonely, who had once believed they didn't deserve love. But they had found each other. Between rain and gunfire, between illness and danger, between everything that could have torn them apart, they had still found each other. And that was enough. This story reminds us that kindness is never forgotten. Sometimes a small act, a single moment of courage, can change the entire course of our lives and the lives of those around us. Rosalie saved a stranger and ended up saving herself. She found love, family, and meaning in the last place she expected. The lesson here is never underestimate the power of kindness. Never be afraid to love someone just because you're afraid of losing them. And never believe you don't deserve happiness. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss more moving stories every day. Share this video with people you believe in, people you trust to remember that kindness always finds its way back. We'd truly love to know how this story made you feel. Have you ever met someone who changed your life in an unexpected way? Do you believe a small act can make a big difference? Share your thoughts and feelings in the comments below. We read and cherish every comment from the bottom of our hearts. We wish all of you watching this video strong health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Thank you for staying with us through today's story. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.